All right, so let's get started with our next panel. So if you all could come in, have a seat, we'll get moving. So the next panel is a view from the Hill. We'll hear perspectives from several Hill panelists. Please take your seats, or else your conversations outside. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're honored to have with us here several senior congressional staffers. I'll introduce them quickly. We have John Lynn, who is the Counsel on Communications and Technology Subcommittee in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Jamie Susskind, who's the Legislative Director for the Office of U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn. Johanna Thomas, who's Counsel for the Communications and Technology Subcommittee in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Betsy McIntyre was supposed to be here. Unfortunately, her plane left the gate, turned around, went back to the gate, and ultimately she wasn't able to get here. So we're sorry about that, but grateful for her effort. So let's start off. There's a lot of topics we could talk about. Let's start with spectrum and broadband. So at the highest level, what are the key spectrum issues that Congress is focused on?
First off, Scott and TPI, thank you for having us. This has been a great conference so far, and I want to start out by saying I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not the Committee on Energy Commerce today. Big priority is first turning Spectrum Auction Authority back on. It's been over a year and a half since Spectrum Auction Authority lapsed, and it's been obviously a big concern for us. And our goal is to obviously get it turned on as quickly as possible, because we know that there's a lot of work that needs to happen that cannot happen as long as the FCC does not have this authority. Not just auctioning the licenses that they have in inventory, but it's also starting to plan for future auctions that cannot happen, and as well as doing other studies and things that the auctions division does on a normal basis that they can't do without this authority. So just as a matter of good government, it's important to have Spectrum Authority restored. Along with this is also just what does spectrum policy look like in the future? And that's also wrapped up in this discussion. As we think about, in the past it's been a debate between licensed and unlicensed uses, but now more and more the debate is about how do we manage commercial use versus federal government use. And that's become a big challenge for us as federal agencies have become more and more protective of the spectrum that they have access to and that we think can be made available to be used for commercial use. Thankfully, the administration, even though I'm with the majority, I will say that we are appreciative of the national spectrum strategy that the Biden administration came out with. We think that it sets up a good framework for bands that should be studied for future use to make available for commercial use. We are looking forward to when that process is done so we can be informed of what kind of spectrum we can make available, what's out there. I think right now we're uncomfortable developing legislation that mandates that NTIA and the FCC, identify and auction off X number of megahertz in Y band if we don't know that's even possible. So we think that the spectrum strategy does a good job identifying potential areas, studying that, and then hopefully by the time we get those studies back, we can develop a good pipeline that'll identify enough spectrum for commercial use, both on a licensed and unlicensed basis.
It's on. Hi. Well, thanks again for having me here. As John said, great conference so far. Similar to what John said, I think I speak only for my office. I don't speak for our friends on the Commerce Committee, either minority or majority, or any of the other offices who are here. I think John identified a lot of the key issues. I think it is, irresponsible at this point that we have not been able to get the FCC's auction authority back up and running. I've lost track of how long it's been, but it's been far too long, and that's not okay, frankly. We need to be proactive, and I think most people in this room who follow these issues know that if the U.S. is not leading on this, we're losing. And we need to get this together and get it done. We need to move aggressively to identify bands. I think that many of us know how the folks that we work with well at DoD will approach this issue, and there will always be a reason to say no to a band. I mean that with all due respect to the work that they do there and their needs, but I think that we have sat back a little too long and have not been as assertive on this front. That's not me necessarily poking at committee, but I think that we need to be able to collectively, right? That's what our office is as members of the committee need to do, is to get it done. I think it is unfortunate. I think we've gotten sidetracked with important conversations that we should be having, but perhaps not in the context of how do we immediately reauthorize the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority. So, ACP has been talked about here. It has been talked about at our various hearings and markups. Rip and replace is obviously still a big deal. I think that it is tough to talk about how you allocate and spend money when you don't even have the authority to collect or set up a mechanism to get that money. You have no idea how much money you will have. I know those are things that many members think are important, but we need to move a little bit quicker to set up the mechanism. I do think that if we let this Congress end without doing that, that would be very disappointing.
Thanks so much, Scott, for having me in TPI. Just like John said, I speak on behalf of myself and not on behalf of the committee or any of our members. On Spectrum, this has been an area of bipartisanship, especially in the House. We have passed bills through the House that the Senate has not taken up. We've worked with the Senate when we could to try to find an agreement, and we would love to continue. We would love to continue engaging with the Senate to find a solution here. I mean, Jamie and John, I think, hit on the big points here. We need spectrum for American innovation to make sure we lead, that American and Western values are shaping the decisions that are made in the wireless sector, and not the values of countries that believe in I can't say it. You understand. Authoritism. And that's really important to Representative Pallone and our members. We continue to engage on this. We agree that the Biden-Harris administration has taken excellent steps in moving the conversation forward. There is definitely a role for Congress to play here. The House stands ready to work with the Senate in completing the job.
So let's pretend that I'm really naive and don't understand how Congress works, just really hypothetically.
There's a good Schoolhouse Rock video for you.
Why is Spectrum Authority not being renewed? I mean, on a bipartisan basis, everyone agrees it should be, and on a bipartisan basis, it doesn't happen. And then given that, why do we have it set up so that it has to be renewed? Why isn't it permanent?
Well, I think that's a question for the people from 2012. I don't know that we can answer that question. Yeah, you could call Chairman Rosenworcel, I guess. But yeah, I mean, look, I can only speak for, again, like me and my office, right? We have had markups. There have been spectrum bills on there. They were unfortunately not bipartisan. Obviously, this needs to be a bipartisan endeavor in order to get this done. It was in 2012, and it needs to continue to be. As I said in my last comment, right, I think that if you sort of bite off more than you can chew, then maybe things get diluted. And if you're not sort of focused on the topic at hand, which is reauthorizing their auction authority and maybe identifying some key bands for auction, it's too big a dialogue. And I think we all know that sometimes when the dialogue gets big, it just gets tough to reach consensus in Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the way it works, you need four corners to move a spectrum bill, and that means you have to have the top leaders of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the top leaders of the Senate Commerce Committee to come together and, move a four-corner package. We were close in 2022. Unfortunately, we just couldn't get it over the finish line due to outside events, but, ultimately, that's what you need, and you have to have all willing parties to come together to make that happen.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of stakeholders now have spectrum, and they're very protective of that spectrum. And when they get their committees of jurisdiction fired up about it, it becomes harder for us to pass that deal. And, could we do like a blanket, just, reauthorize spectrum for X days? Yes, we could. That is one thing. But there's a fear by some other committees that's, the camel's nose into the tent, that once we start doing that, that means that their spectrum could be up next, and that's the fear that they have. And unfortunately, we're trying to work, both with the administration. We've had great allies there. Scott Blake here is sitting in front of me. He did a great job trying to get consensus there. But unfortunately, that doesn't always work. Even when the administration seems to be going in the same direction, they might not actually be. And they can get their other stakeholders involved to make the process more difficult. And that's why it's become so hard to pass it now. As to why, we have to renew it, I think spectrum auctions generate a lot of revenue for the federal government, and for us, it's one way that we can fund telecom priorities. And that's something, that's another discussion we can have about the wisdom of tying spectrum auctions to funding and whether or not that's sustainable anymore. But for a long time, it's been a good source of revenue, and for things that we can't necessarily get through, the appropriations process, here's another way we can do it.
Yeah, CBO, folks who sort of work on this, and I'm not an expert on CBO, but CBO is to some degree sort of a black box on how they score things and how many years out can you sort of hit as the sweet spot. And I know that, committee was having conversations, and again, I won't speak for committee, I can speak for my boss that, I think we preferred more than, say, 2 years, but obviously 10 years may be too much. But again, those are conversations that I know committee has to have
Why
with
would it be
CBO.
too much? Just in principle, why would 10 years be too much?
I think my sense from CBO is that you hit sort of like a parabola of when you make the most money. But then there's also the question of, when do you have to go back and do it again?
So it's just, again, it's obscure.
I think there's also a feel that spectrum is dynamic and it changes on a consistent, what we think is great today and the different policies we have today may or may not be the policies that we want to approach, 5, 6, 7 years from now. And given that dynamic nature, I think there's definitely the spending part in CBO and just the intricacies, how you score a bill, and et cetera. But I think just from a technical, technology standpoint, I think there's a real fear that if we let the authority go for too long, Congress doesn't get to assert ourselves in spectrum policy and the decisions that are being made. And, we want Congress, especially, I know a lot has been talked about, the fall of Chevron and major questions. And I think this is an area where the, committees of jurisdiction feel like we want to have a say and, have an ability to articulate our thoughts on this.
So, John, you mentioned the camel's nose under the tent. So now that we've brought fauna into it, has Harold Feld identified the elephant in the room here? Basically, is DOD the problem?
They are one. Again, we have other. Again, I mentioned there are many stakeholders who have access to spectrum who are very concerned, and I think that's another thing is what we've learned the last couple years is that spectrum battles have become more and more prevalent in administration. And we're not just talking about DoD, but we had the 24 gigahertz issue with NOAA back in 2019, the FAA C-band issue in 2021, 2022. So as more agencies realize how pervasive spectrum is and how, the more we want to make available for commercial use and how that might affect their uses of spectrum, they are more on guard. And so part of this also then dovetails into how do we reform the spectrum management process at the federal government level. NTIA is supposed to be the federal manager of spectrum. They are supposed to be the ones who, decide who gets to use what bands and how. But unfortunately, they are a sub-agency trying to tell behemoths like DOD, the FAA, what to do, and that doesn't always work. And again, that's where they get their stakeholders involved who then influence other members of Congress or other factors in the administration, and that make this process so difficult.
And on the DOD point, I want to add that, I think one thing, DOD is an agency we have to work with and, try to find some solutions or power through to get, to help make federal spectrum available. That being said, I think one thing that you often see with DoD is that they throw out the national security argument. And yes, there are definitely spectrum bands that are being used for a lot of national security priorities. And we understand that. And we too care a lot about national security, as I know we'll talk about later. But I think one thing you will hear a lot from, I think, both sides of the aisle, but I know Representative Pallone and our members have made this point, is that economic security is a part of national security. And that you cannot, that to have an economy that is, one of the best in the world, if not the best in the world, and making sure that American innovation and, what we're doing here from an economic standpoint helps on the broader kind of national security front. And so, I think a lot of times we hear from DOD and others, oh, you all just don't care about national security. It's like, no, we very much do care, but, as members of the committee, Secretary Raimondo, Assistant Secretary Davidson, and the FCC, Chairwoman Rosenworcel and others have pointed out, like, economic security is a part of this conversation.
So this question, you might not be the exact right people to ask this question, but I always wonder, and so I like to ask a question when lots of people have to listen to me. Like you said, some of the FCC's budget comes from auction revenues. I mean, there's the amount appropriated by Congress, and then there are these other funds. So when there are no auction revenues, like, what happens to that part of the FCC's budget?
Well, they do have auction authority. They still have some auction authority.
A little bit.
And so they are using that authority, I think, to continue the auction. The limited authority they have, they are using the funding that they have. My understanding is the funding that they have from auction revenues that are in, their accounts are still being used to help fund the auction authority they have. So they still have very limited authority. Our goal is to obviously provide them general auction authority.
But it's not good, right? So, I mean, they have employees who are FTEs that are designated, like a lot of the folks who work in OET, right, are designated under auction revenue authority, right? And so you wonder what happens. I know there's people here from T-Mobile, and T-Mobile literally had to have a legislative fix done to get their 2.5 licenses. And that's not, frankly, I mean, I think that's just ridiculous that that had to go that far. So that's why we need to get this up and running, both for the employees that work at the commission and the functions that they do on a daily basis, things like equipment authorizations, but also because there are companies that are making major investments in the U.S., and they need to be able to, follow through on those investments.
That's interesting. So, I mean, so the lack of spectrum authority has much broader implications than just running auctions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, well, staying on the question of spectrum, I think maybe Jamie, I think, or maybe Johanna mentioned the importance of the United States being kind of in the lead and competitive internationally. Can you expand on that a little more? Like, what does a U.S. position in spectrum mean? What are the things we need to be involved in that either we are doing well or that we need to do more on?
You wanna?
Do you want me to start? Okay. I think from a spectrum policy, the United States government should be involved in every spectrum conversation going on anywhere in the world. I think the ways that we do that is there's shared jurisdiction between the FCC, NTIA, and state to represent the United States government at the International Telecommunication Union and all the lead up that you need to do for the World Radio Conference, which for those who don't know, every 4 years, kind of like the Olympics of spectrum, is the World Radio Conference where they make global decisions on spectrum bands. There's a lot of steps. There are experts in this room who could talk about it even more on how those decisions are made. And it is the responsibility of NTIA, the FCC, and the State Department to go represent for the United States to come up with our positions and then go advocate those positions at every level that you need to up until, to the World Radio Conference. And one thing that we have worked on a bipartisan basis leading up to the World Radio Conference was last year. So leading up to last year's World Radio Conference is we met with state, NTIA, and the FCC regularly to understand what the decisions were being made, the positions they were taking, where there was conflict, and how they were going to resolve it. So we definitely took a very, we used our oversight responsibilities and took those to heart and, wanted to make sure that the U.S. was standing, in a place where we can go to our region and then to the World Radio Conference to articulate our positions. I think there are improvements that can continue to try to be made, and we want to see the U.S. lead in this area, and so we will continue to advocate for that.
I think we've developed a lot of our spectrum positions through the democratic process, through collaboration with the public sector, the private sector, and trying to make sure ensure that those decisions are replicated elsewhere. The big benefit for us is that a lot of our firms have developed the technology for that. And if we can obviously export that around the world, that's good for our economic security, and it's good thus for national security too. So that's what when we think about leadership, is how can we make sure that, you know, the decisions we make can become the global standard. We don't want it to be, as Johanna alluded to earlier, authoritarian countries with their top-down methods pushing undemocratic control type decisions on spectrum bands that, frankly, then the rest of the world has to follow, that benefit them and make them more powerful. That's not what we want. So when we talk about global leadership, it is us working with our allies to push that American position, that democratic position, so that we can continue to be the dominant force in
And on that point, to piggyback on what John said, and I apologize, Jamie,
No, you're fine.
is that, you know, there are charts that will show that when it comes to, you also, you know, often in spectrum conversations, you hear the fight between licensed and unlicensed. As John mentioned, in America, we've taken an approach where we value both. People can disagree and, you know, which way we're leaning and how we should be moving. But, you know, when you look at unlicensed spectrum, the United States, in some charts, leads the world in making unlicensed spectrum available, which has allowed for Wi-Fi and other unlicensed technologies to flourish, which has been really great for American innovation, and, you know, the different technologies and devices that we all have that rely on those unlicensed technologies. When it comes to license, you know, we are kind of in the middle of the pack. I think there's work to do there for sure, but I think those are, you know, that is an example of like us going to the World Radio Conference and pushing some of the bands that we have made available for unlicensed and trying to get the world to support it, or the bands that we've made for licensed, going to the World Radio Conference and trying to get the world to do that, because we all know that economies of scale are what is needed to help the wireless sector flourish. And so it's, and how you make those bands available, like what technologies, you know, the shapes, and like John said, not, you know, some countries have one way they want to do spectrum policy. I think in America, and other Western countries, you see a diversity in how we have tried to make spectrum available for different bands and, you know, use different models.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the questions that came in. I mean, what's great about our spectrum policy is it's a hybrid of both. We need both licensed and we need unlicensed. And I think that as we think about policy, like I don't think it's a partisan issue anymore. I think we've come to the consensus that we need both. I mean, we have the 6 gigahertz band.
Yeah.
We are the only country. We are one of the only countries that does that unlicensed, and we want to make sure other countries do that too and preserve that. So I think, you know, this idea that, you know, the mentality has changed over the years from being licensed versus unlicensed. So no, we need all of the above in order to make our ecosystem work, and that's a good thing for us, and that's something that we want other countries to adopt as well.
I agree with all of it. I don't know that I have that much to add. I would say that generally this isn't maybe a trend that is only in the spectrum area, right? And I know, Scott, when you sort of reached out to us about this, you mentioned standards in general, right? But I think that, you know, in any standards body, right, there's a need for the U.S. to be leading, and sort of, you know, you'll see countries like China, you know, try to get their folks appointed to like all of the standards leadership positions, and they send more people, and, you know, they have folks that can invest more time and more resources in that. And, you know, our private sector folks do a really good job, but also, you know, I think we need to make sure that we are coordinated and that the U.S. is investing their resources in it. You know, shameless plug for a bill that my boss had done with Senator Warner on it that Commerce Committee just marked up on that front. But you know, I think that you see this issue in sort of all global standard setting bodies, and so we want to make sure that the U.S. is, you know, harmonized, and that the U.S. position is one that we can continue to push so we win these races.
So continuing with that, are we in trouble? Is our participation decreasing? Are we losing influence? And what if anything, can you all do about it?
I mean, that's not, so I should say, right, I mean, obviously we have legislation. We're not hearing people come to us from a negative view, right? I think, and I used to work when I was at CTA on standards issues, and I think that companies in the US actually do a really good job. But I do think that to some degree, we are under-resourced. Folks just don't have, you know, frankly, like the money to go. They don't have the staff to go to these things. NIST does a really great job, but NIST doesn't have enough people to do everything that NIST needs to do, and they can't always send people abroad. So I think that we just need to be cognizant that the U.S. government is coordinated and playing an appropriate role to support the private sector in the developments that they're pushing at these standards bodies.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of these standards bodies is they're all consensus driven.
Yeah.
It's not, who has the most, it's not a vote. It's not like who's the most popular. And so thankfully, even though China might flood the zone with all these engineers and other people, they're producing bad research. It doesn't get adopted. But to Jamie's point, it's what do we do to support our companies? What kind of technical assistance can we provide them? What kind of financial support can we provide them to help them attend these conferences and produce that high quality research that will win this consensus driven process? So I don't think we're necessarily losing so much as we could do more to support our companies to help them compete.
And I think it's really important that we pay attention, and so that we've talked to a lot of people, and again, this is an area of bipartisanship where, if there's an area where you think the U.S. or companies are not being supported or need extra help, or we need to push agencies to make decisions, please come to us and let us know, because we do not want the U.S. to fall behind. I don't think we've heard that we are, but I think, paying attention to this area, it's not one that always gets a lot of attention, but it's critically important. And helps, set the next stage of technology and who gets to lead and make these decisions on the values and how this technology is distributed to all of us.
So there's a question about CBRS and how to address U.S. policy not bringing sharing routines, et cetera. But so let's broaden that question. And how do you take issues that are controversial within the U.S. and how different industries and nonprofits and all civil society and all different kinds of groups argue about it? How do you handle those and take them into an international setting to try to make progress, however that might be defined?
I think ultimately you have a decider, and the administration takes all of the input that we receive and helps make the best decision for our country going forward. And so that is the role of the executive agency, the president really, in kind of what we're going to push on the international stage. But I think it's a very democratic process, and we like to think we get to democratic solutions.
Only I'll say is it's like any innovation, you put it out there and you test it. CBRS is an American innovation. We've heard that it's had successes. We've heard there's some things that could be done better. But if we can prove that it works, then that's something we can then bring out to these standards bodies, the ITU, the WRC, and then promote. So it's just a matter of getting it out there and seeing how it plays out.
I have nothing on CBRS. Sorry.
Okay. So let's turn to universal service and the ACP. And before we start talking about the ACP specifically, let's keep, there's a question here, I forget what it was. Anyway, the question was, you said that we reach these by democratic means. And so the starting question for ACP is, set aside what you think about ACP. It's hugely popular. Why can't it be extended?
I think from our side, we recognize that it was set up initially as a temporary COVID program, but as you mentioned, it was popular, and I think that we are open to discussion of keeping it going. There are two big problems, though. One, we think that it does need to be reformed because too many people are eligible for it. We think that it should be reformed to be more targeted towards the households that truly need the subsidy to afford broadband. We found out through this, when we did have it, that there were a lot of homes, people who were heads of trade associations in D.C. who qualified for ACP.
They clearly need to be paid more.
Obviously, so that's clearly a problem that we need to look at and reform. But the other part of this is how do you pay for it? There's still bills out there that have $6-7 billion without a pay for, and that's just not sustainable. And so if we can identify a source to do this, this is one reason why we kind of come out with our long-term views of universal service fund reform. That's something we'd be open to discussing, potentially merging ACP in with Lifeline, improving our affordability programs so that, they have a long-term funding solution and work better at helping people that truly need the subsidy to afford broadband, get broadband. I think one thing that our members aren't interested in is having this constant annual cliff of every year. You know, if we just do this $7 billion patch now, okay, next year we have to come back and do it again and then again and again. That's just not sustainable for this program. And frankly, it's not sustainable from our side, and I can't imagine companies or households want to have that either, where they're constantly on this cliff of, is this gonna continue, is it not? So I think for us, let's figure out those reforms and figure out how to make this a long-term solution, and then let's go forward and implement.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tricky one for a few reasons. I know that you had brought up universal service more broadly, and the Fifth Circuit complicates things, and happy to get into that at some point. I think if you sort of start thinking about ACP, the question also becomes, what do you do with Lifeline? And then as a corollary to that, it's, do you need to reform Section 254, which in light of the Fifth Circuit, I would argue you probably do. So what do you do there? I think, as John said, right, like this needs to be a conversation. I don't know how many people followed the Senate Commerce markup from late July, but like a $7 billion ACP amendment sort of got thrown in at the last minute. And, I think that's not the way to have this conversation, right? It's an important conversation, but like, let's have a real conversation. Let's not just sort of throw stuff in there at the last minute without giving members an opportunity to think through these nuances, which, again, I think in light of Loper Bright and in light of the Fifth Circuit and in light of all of these things, right, like this is not as easy as just reauthorize this program and make it permanent.
I don't think it will shock anyone that House Democrats are extremely supportive of the ACP program and have been calling for refunding it for this entire Congress. Ranking Member Pallone and several members, including Representative Clark, have pushed this. We have put forward bills. I think our members are frustrated that Republican leadership has not, been willing to kind of come to the table and help try to find a bipartisan solution. But, bipartisanship, at least on the Subcommittee for Communication and Technology, is something we highly value, and we stand ready, House Democrats stand ready to work with our Republican colleagues to try to find a permanent solution to ACP, whether that is, obviously there's a lot of work being done right now on USF through the working group, the bipartisan bicameral working group. I think from House Democrats' perspective, what you've seen in our bills is trying to fund it now and, work towards finding a long-term solution. But, we are willing and ready to engage because we think this is an important program that has benefited communities across the country and red states, blue states, all states. We think there is some real value here, and, we will fight extremely hard to try to bring it back.
So to put back on, or to leave on my naive cap, so one of the things the ACP did was show that we can fund universal service programs out of general revenues. And we, from an economist's point of view, that's the efficient way to pay for a program rather than taxing any specific service. Is there a chance that, let's say the Fifth Circuit holds, or even if it doesn't, that universal service can be funded through general revenues? That's our progressive tax system. It's, would solve every problem except Congress people having to vote for it.
On a first principles, if you're starting from a blank piece of paper, sure, I think I would agree with you. But that we are 30 years into the USF system, and we have such a broken budget and appropriations process that the idea of shifting a $8 billion fund into the appropriations process, which we can barely use to fund our own government, is not going to be easy. So I think, again, while it all makes sense and it's easy for us to talk about here in a conference like this or in policy debates, in terms of the practicalities of doing it would have to be part of a broader budget discussion that, unfortunately, I don't think we're ready to have.
When you say broader budget discussion, you mean really broad?
Yeah,
or not just USF broad?
Yeah,
but
we're talking federal budget, because now we're putting an annual $8 billion program into the budget. How does that affect tax rates? How does that affect the deficit, especially? My party overthrew a speaker over spending this past year. So I'm not going to say that something like that, adding putting something like this on budget is going to be an easy discussion for us.
I mean, I do think you're probably right on the face of things, and this is me as me and not me as Senator Blackburn necessarily, but I mean, I think, right, on the face of things, yes, I think that's probably the better solution, query what happens with the Fifth Circuit decision, does it go to the Supreme Court, sort of does it hold, I'm not sure. But I think that, again, that in the context of the, Chevron falling away, I think highlights that there are deficiencies with the USF program. And then I think we probably, if it's going to continue, probably needs to be rewritten. 254, if nothing else, probably needs to be rewritten. So, there is a role for Congress to be playing here. I guess maybe I'm skeptical. I don't know that I'm skeptical about it sort of being a tax. I don't know about the delegation issue. I've looked at this decision a few times. I'm up in the air, and we'll sort of see where they go. But, John is right practically that I don't know how we do that.
Right.
It's just tough.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I echo what Jamie and John said. I think it's just practically going to be really hard, especially when you have a program that's been in existence for so long. I think, reforms are likely going to, obviously, the House and Senate are working on reforms and trying to find a path forward here, whether, I'm sure contribution reform is part of it, other things are part of it. And, we'll just kind of have to see how those conversations go. And, also from a jurisdictional standpoint, I think, the House and the Senate, and this is kind of wonky Hill stuff, like putting it in general appropriations, I think will give some members some concern about, our ability to kind of oversee this and make sure that from a committee standpoint that we, have strong insight and not necessarily letting our appropriator friends get to dictate everything.
Jumping onto that, I think we've alluded enough to USF reform. I think we all recognize the need to do that. For our perspective, we need to start distribution reform. In the last 4 years, we've spent significant, billions, almost over $100 billion on broadband alone, both deployment, affordability, and connecting schools and for telehealth. So the question we have is what does the USF look like moving forward? Post all this, post infrastructure spending. And that's something that our members are interested in as we have this discussion. That's, what is the high cost fund going to look like after BEAD is done? Is it probably going to need to be more focused on operational expenses, given that we should, if BEAD meets its promise, we will close the digital divide once and for all. So what do we need? What's the high cost fund going to support? What is the low income program going to look like? It's probably going to be some sort of hybrid between ACP and Lifeline if it were to continue, but we won't have two anymore, that's for sure. What about telehealth and school connectivity? So these are questions our members want to discuss first and figure out what is the future of these 4 programs, and then once we figure out the distribution side, let's look at contributions. Is there a better system of contributions here? Obviously, using interstate and international voice service is a declining revenue source. So what do we look at? Do we look at bias? Do we look at big tech and other edge providers? That's something that we're trying to figure out. But we think that this needs to be a part of our broader discussion. As Johanna mentioned, we're very proud. Chairman Latta of our subcommittee is proud to be part of the bipartisan, bicameral USF working group. We've had some very good discussions. We're hoping we can get that into legislative text and maybe push through. But it's something that needs to happen, especially as we I think the Fifth Circuit decision is a good catalyst for this. Obviously ACP going away has been another catalyst for this discussion. I think it's very important.
Yeah, look, historically, and I worked in TAPD for many years at the FCC. Historically, the FCC makes a lot of decisions about how USF is administered. They have a lot of discretion, for better or for worse, and USAC itself has a lot of discretion about how stuff is implemented and administered. And I think, I don't know that if you, sort of sitting out there unless you've seen it, maybe it's one of those things that you sort of don't think about, but, query sort of in light of where administrative law is going, and I know we have a panel on that after us, right? Query how much the FCC can do on this front. I don't know.
I have nothing.
Okay, well, so in these talks on contribution reforms, and I really appreciate the point of we should know how much it is we want to spend first. Do they consider the regressive nature of the current tax? I mean, it's one of the most regressive taxes we have in this country. Does that come into play in these discussions?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, especially, and then, the other questions about like, does it make sense to tax what we're trying to subsidize as well? Like, that's another question. I mean, that is something that is being debated, but also like, does it have to be an assessment on revenues, Scott? Can it be connections models? Can it be, there was a whole universe, and, many academics have looked into this that, that we're examining to figure out what the right contribution base is. But obviously that's a big discussion, and dare I say, like the most complicated and complex discussion of this whole.
I want nothing to do with it. Never
I mean,
have, never will.
I would say from like a House Democratic's perspective, I mean, I don't know that, obviously we understand the economics and the taxing. I think, one thing that we also try to think about here is consumers and making sure that, I mean, from our committee perspective, we think everyone should have access to the internet at an affordable rate, and that's an important objective. And again, we're willing to work on a bipartisan path forward, especially in light of all that has transpired in the last few months in the courts. But I think, one thing that Ranking Member Pallone, one of his key focuses on is like what is good for consumers. And we want to hear from all parties and all sides. But, at the end of the day, that is, going to be one of his guiding lights, and understanding that, people need the internet to live in the American modern economy, and we need to make sure that everyone can afford it.
So let's turn to, the time we have left, to national security, because that's become an increasingly important part of tech policy. So tell us about your work on those issues, and sort of where the pressure points are, where the disagreements are, what's going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think national security has been a big priority for us, especially as it comes to, dealing with our adversaries, primarily the Chinese Communist Party. If you look at the last few years, Congress has been very active in this space. We passed the Secure and Trusted Communications Act in 2020, which created the Whip and Replace program to get Huawei and ZTE equipment out of our networks. We passed the Secure Equipment Act. This Congress, we passed the TikTok divestment bill. So we view that, especially given that the CCP has made telecom one of their big priority industries, we're very active in making sure that we are doing our best to strengthen our companies, but also addressing the threat that might be coming in. And so I think it's been an area of tremendous bipartisanship between us and our colleagues on the other side. We're very proud of that. And I also would be remiss if I didn't mention things like CHIPS and the Public Wireless Supply Chain Innovation Fund, which is doing things on ORAN to help, again, boost American industries to compete globally, and help combat the threat that China poses.
Yeah, this has been a big area for Ranking Member Pallone. He was one of the lead sponsors for the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act. He pushed very hard to make sure that the Open RAN, the Public Wireless Innovation Fund was fully funded through the CHIPS Act. It's critically important. Telecom, communications infrastructure, our applications, et cetera, are critical infrastructure, and we need to make sure that our foreign adversaries are not accessing it and manipulating it and causing harm to Americans. So it's something we take very seriously. We are very proud of our bipartisan work. We've done other bills. I know drones came up. That's something we have thought a lot about. CHIPS as well. But it is it's a really important area for the committee because we want to protect our communications infrastructure. We've had several hearings this year on cybersecurity, AI, all the things, all in a bipartisan framework, to make sure that America is not only leading in this space globally, or, and making sure that Congress is putting in the policies, or at least reviewing all that is going on to make sure that, the laws that are in place, or if we need new laws to ensure innovation, but also keep our networks and our software and hardware safe.
I'm also talking on the TikTok panel, so I won't reiterate stuff, but yes, I think we agree.
We should probably give back some time because we're running late. But just very quickly, this last question came in about satellite and space. We had a great session last night. But is this something that Congress gets involved in? Sort of this new area?
It's something that Energy and Commerce, yes, Congress gets involved. There's a whole committee on the House side, the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. The Energy and Commerce Committee, though, is certainly in the last few years taken a big interest in space. It's really important to us. Our science colleagues. On the Senate, you have it a little easier because space is part of Senate Commerce. So it's a little bit easier for them to work together. But we have worked with our science colleagues, or at least defended our role for the Energy and Commerce to be in space. We're really pleased we have passed the Launch Communications Act this year, which would help make more spectrum available for launches, which are increasingly occurring given all the activity in space. So we want to make sure that there's a streamlined way for launch companies to have the spectrum for launch and reentry. We worked on the Alert Parity Act in a bipartisan framework, which would help make satellites available, make spectrum available for satellites when there are natural disasters or other emergencies where people cannot connect to terrestrial networks. And I'm sure this came up in the panel last night. I couldn't make it, but we see this huge convergence happening, and the need for fiber, for wireless, for space, for satellites. And so it is definitely an area that the Energy and Commerce Committee, I feel like I can say on a bipartisan basis, is really focused on. As John Dingell, some of you may have heard this before, used to say, if it moves, it's energy and everything else is commerce, which really annoys the other committees on the House side, because that means Energy and Commerce feels like we should assert ourselves in a lot of conversations. And space is definitely one of those.
So he used to also point at a globe and say, that's my jurisdiction, but now we're trying to go beyond that.
Yeah,
exactly.
We're going to the
Exactly.
whole-
But I think as more innovation happens in the space world, we're going to need more, need to improve the way that we license communications with our satellites and all the other cool things we're putting up there. And that's why we prioritize modernizing the satellite licensing process here. And unfortunately, we had some problems with our colleagues at a different committee over jurisdiction. But we think that it's important to modernize the satellite licensing process because it takes too long. It's cumbersome and it doesn't encourage people to license to base their operations here in the United States. So what can we do to make it to encourage that innovation to happen here? And if we can do regulatory reform to do that, we should encourage that.
Yeah, we don't have the jurisdictional issue, as Johanna said. I think Senator Schmidt runs our subcommittee on this with Senator Sinema, and I know he's been very forward on these issues. I know historically space is an issue that Ranking Member Cruz has cared about, given NASA. We in Tennessee actually border Huntsville and their facilities, and a lot of the folks who work at Huntsville live in Chattanooga, so it's a thing we care about a lot. So I'm hopeful that Senate Commerce will also start focusing on some of these issues and sort of get some more bills going in this space, because I think it's something positive that most people, feel optimistic about.
All right, I think we should leave it there. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, especially for me not knowing much about the process. I love hearing about this from you. I really like seeing that people in different parties can still disagree with each other and be happy about it. I don't think we see enough of that. And I thought this was really interesting. Thank you so much. Please join me. Thank you. And now we're going to learn about major questions. So major questions. Thanks so much. That was great. Okay?
Okay, appreciate it.
Thanks.
That was fun.
Yeah, it was. Thank you so much.